why shouldn't there be a demand license? Why can't we replicate what's already there for a generation license? The challenge which we've got is just really creating the capacity within the industry to spend the time to get this written down. But we're running at breakneck speed. We're going through connection reform. We've got a once in a generation opportunity to bring a huge amount of capital investment into the UK. And if we take too long, we're too conservative, then we may miss that opportunity as well. So it's that kind of balance between risk and UK PLC reward here. So I think we've all got to go down this route.
Welcome to the Connectology podcast. I'm Hugh Taylor, CEO here at Road Taylor, and in these episodes, our grid connection specialists, or connectologists, dive into the evolving grid connections landscape, often taking expert guests with them in order to discover, generate, and share insights that might just help you and maybe even industry as a whole to connect projects faster, at lower risk, and at lower cost.
Hello and welcome to another Road Taylor Connectology podcast. I'm Pete Aston, one of the engineers here at Road Taylor, and I'm joined by my colleague Philip Bale and David Wildash from Apatura. So welcome, nice to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So this is actually the third session that we've recorded now on demand connections and all the sort of ins and outs of that that's really sort of coming out the woodwork at the moment.
Absolutely.
But before we get into the detail of that, David, if you could sort of just introduce yourself and Apatura, just give us a bit of a sketch of the company.
Great, certainly. So thanks very much for having me today. So David Wildash, Chief Strategy Officer for Apatura. So who are Apatura? We're fundamentally a developer company. We've had a rich history in developing batteries north of the border. We've got 2.2 gigawatts of consented batteries, and we, like everybody else, waiting to see what happens through the reform process. But very much we saw an opportunity 12, 14 months ago, driven by demand for critical digital infrastructure, to look at how we could contribute, looking at our sites, originating new land tracks, which was going to play into the data center market. So this is very much an area where we are really focused as well. Our core proposition is to deploy batteries and data centers, and we're quite unique. We've got a large footprint of assets in Scotland, or across the Central Belt, and we're looking to originate at this point in time 2.3 gigawatts of demand specifically for data centers.
Brilliant. Okay, that's a nice teaser.
Yeah, absolutely.
Already I'm going, I want to know more. So you're obviously sort of you're transmission focused, aren't you? So what do you see as some of the key issues that have been coming up recently? And there's a lot of them, I think. But what are some of the key issues that have really cropped up in this sort of demand space?
Yeah. So I think if we step back and go, well, actually, we've been in a position where there's been huge de-industrialization for the last 15, 20 years. And it's not been an area that's had to necessarily be thought of in terms of how do you connect major industrial loads at the transmission level. And then lo and behold, we've just seen this, this huge rise in need and the desire for compute power, which is very kind of energy intensive. And that's very much our model of making sure that these are positioned near to where the renewables are, hence Scotland. But fundamentally, be it data centers, be it large scale industrial processes, the system needs to change to put them on a level playing field with generation, to make sure that efficient connection offers can be provided, to make sure that we can get these onto the system, driving that economic growth for the country that's needed. So there's a real kind of need for change across this. And just to put that in perspective, the numbers are huge. I think it was a Tech UK report, I believe it was last year, but it was looking at currently 4.5 gross value add, 4.5 billion, I should say, gross value add from the data center data center market. You roll that forward to 2035, and that's suggested to be 45 billion. This is a huge opportunity. And we shouldn't forget that we are in competition, not just us as a developer against others who are looking to originate new data center projects in the UK, but also against Europe. Globally, there's a huge amount of capital that needs to be deployed, but they're going to choose the areas where they can get connections quickly, resiliently, and indeed where as well. So we need to bring all those things together. But to your point around demand, what needs to change? for me, it's that equitability between how generation's looked at and how demand is looked at.
And one of the things that you may well have found is that obviously there's been a significant uptake in generation connections of the transmission system because the distribution capacity was used up, which then meant that they'd secured the bays, which then means when you try and go and secure transmission demand projects, if it's standalone, you're going to obviously be connecting into new connection nodes until the reform happens to then work out which projects are ready and needed and where may there be bays for those projects.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point around, well, actually, how many bays do you need for these projects? Certainly with ours, we started these as batteries, and I should say we see a huge amount of benefit in deploying batteries with data centres, wholesale energy arbitrage that the battery can provide, potentially offset there, but also around power quality, which is going to be a big issue when you bring in major demand onto the system as well. So there's lots of benefits from that. So to start with, our connection offers had bays for the batteries, but when you look at actually the SQSS and what's needed and what the data center operators and hyperscalers want, they want resilient power. SQSS above 300 or 350 megawatts, you need 3 substation bays. But in reality, when you're talking to hyperscalers and data center operators, creating a resilient connection and getting access with a dual bay solution to one of the world's most resilient networks that we've got here in the UK should be sufficient. So we spend a lot of time making sure that we can provide that, making sure we can get dual bay resilience, but also looking at a pathway to power these major demand sites as well.
I'm glad you said that around the SQSS compliance in terms of connections. So your ultimate outcome for the majority of your schemes would be 400 kV bays connected in for data centres. Up to what sort of scale would you like to see GB say these projects are sufficient for having 2 bays connected into these systems?
So it doesn't necessarily need to be at 400, but 400 275 is kind of where we're looking at, and I do have big umbrage around the difference between England, Wales, and Scotland and what 132 looks like, but that's another argument we may come back to. But in reality, I think as we look at the scarcity of substation bays across the UK, we need to make sure that they are being utilised well. So, putting in a 50 megawatt battery to a 400 kV bay where you could get a lot more power out of that, that's probably not the most efficient solution. So we're looking at dual bay, 275 or 400, depending on what it was. But, we're going up to 550 megawatts of load in a single site. And, talking about that one, that's Ravenscraig. So that's probably our kind of jewel in the crown in terms of the portfolios that we're building out currently.
So in terms of some of those then key issues with the building out of sites, what's your view as a company on the issue with demand projects not being able to build out transmission assets? Because that seems to be like the key issue that's being debated at the moment, is that demand customers don't have a license, unlike a generation customer which has the license and they can build out transmission level assets. So you're reliant on the TO building out transmission level assets for you and providing you with effectively a distribution level connection, whether that's 132 or 33. So how are you sort of trying to dig into that particular problem?
Yeah, so there's a number of facets, and how do we deconstruct this? So at the moment in Scotland, Scottish Power or SSEN will build to site. If you're a generation such as a battery storage, we've got standalone battery projects, then actually they will build up to the isolators, and then as a generator you can own the transformer, which steps down the power to connector assets. That's all very fine, that's well understood. Now for demand, you can't. And there's a very simple solution in my mind, is actually you just need to move where the isolators are and where the transformer is. So fundamentally, it comes down to, is a transformer classified as a transmission asset under the Electricity Act. And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had, and also just real guidance to get rid of this ambiguity of what is transmission, what's not. So I think as an industry, we need to work with government and indeed the regulator to make that inherently clear. So there's just a little switch across a boundary, then actually you can, transport power at the voltage which is economical for sites and get through the issues that we've currently got of demand not being able to own transmission assets. The other way of looking at it, as we're co-locating generation, BESS, and demand, well, actually, you have a generation license for your BESS asset. Does that count? So there are a lot of open questions and ambiguity that needs to be kind of worked through. So certainly we're part of the conversation amongst the other guests that you've had on today. Really think about, well, what are the opportunities? Who needs to make the decisions to make sure that as an economy that we do not miss out on these huge opportunities that are ahead of us.
And what do you think about the possibility of demand projects being able to have a demand license? And therefore, and so build out transmission level assets as well.
So coming from these, so historically, I wear a heavy system operator hat. As long as this is looked at from a perspective of making sure that everything is compliant, I think grid code does need to catch up for major demand sites such as this, and there's no detriment to the system. Then actually, why shouldn't there be a demand license? Why can't we replicate what's already there for a generation license? The challenge which we've got is just really creating the capacity within the industry to spend the time to get this written down. But we're running at breakneck speed. We're going through connection reform. We've got a once in a generation opportunity to bring a huge amount of capital investment into the UK. And if we take too long and we're too conservative, then we may miss that opportunity as well. So it's that kind of balance between risk and UK PLC reward here. So I think we've all got to go down this route.
Thank you for listening so far. If insights like these are valuable in your work, then feel free to subscribe and stay current as Britain's connections landscape continues to evolve. Now, back to the connectologists.
Obviously, I think there's numerous different benefits that you could be said and pros and cons to any approach. Obviously, one of which that if you own the asset, you can build it yourself, you can specify it yourself. You may well be able to build it quicker than the TO could build it. I'm guessing one of the things and one of the advantages that you would look at is that if it is your asset, potentially you could step away from the same SQSS that the TO would do. You mentioned earlier around the 350 megawatt threshold in terms of what's needed. Is there also an element of looking at it of going, well, actually, for some of these industrial commercial projects that have the UPSs, that have the generation backup, even if we don't get to the stage immediately of saying these should be transmission-owned systems, there should be that little asterisk in the SQSS, which says this is not domestic, this is not small scale, these are big industrial commercial customers with the backup generation that provides the extra level of security supply, some of which would happen at the P2 level conversations where there are examples where generation has been used to avoid putting in extra circuits.
Yeah, I think it's all part of the conversation. So, there are design variations within the SQSS you need to look through. And I think there is a joined up conversation absolutely there. If you think about where data centers have been, you've got availability zones, which gives a further level of resilience so they can transfer load between each of a trilateral arrangement of data centers. Plus each of those has a dual resilient grid supply point. Plus they've got an uninterruptible power supply as well. So I think there needs to be a joined up conversation with the end customer. What is the level of resilience that is acceptable? Is there a interim glide path where the wider infrastructure needed on the grid to support these assets catches up? So there's a pragmatic conversation to be had on a site-by-site basis, but that all starts with the debate, the conversation, being able to engage both with NESO, with the relevant TO, and indeed Ofgem and the government to come together to go, this is the way that this site is going to operate. we've done all the checks. We want to be a quality participant in the system, so we're at least net neutral and hopefully net beneficial, particularly when you think about the flexibility that can be provided by major demand when you put it with a battery. This all needs to come through to the conversation. How can data centres and other large demand sites be positive to the system? And I've not even started on the curtailment in Scotland, but that's another conversation.
Well, I was just sort of going to touch on that very briefly. Is that there's quite a lot of call for strategic demand as part of the sort of NESO work, and it does seem that the place to put a lot of that strategic demand is in Scotland because of the constraints across the sort of the B6 boundary between Scotland and England. Is that something that's sort of playing a role within site selection and so on that you're looking at, or is that you're just going, that's a NESO question, let them think about that?
So it's something I think about constantly. I see it as part of, dare I say, the uniqueness of the sites that we've been originated. Again, going back to where my old school, system operator hat, it is a slam dunk of an idea of putting demand where you have excess renewables and soaking up that excess renewables to the benefit of every end consumer within the UK. And we shouldn't forget that. The cost of curtailment, me, you, everyone has to pay their share of that. So if there's the right incentive to put demand where it's going to be a net positive from a system perspective and reduce curtailment costs, that's surely got to be a good thing. So I think we'll need to see more, particularly now that zonal's been taken off the table. What does reformed national pricing mean, and how can we make sure that system operability is thought about when site selection comes through? The strategic element, though, Pete, I think is really interesting because this is where we also need real leadership from the government to dictate and show where the industrial strategy truly meets. Anyway, where the rubber hits the road from an industrial strategy perspective, there needs to be that signal of where is the best place and optimal place for community, for economic benefits, for system benefits of putting demand.
And obviously from a technical perspective, very much agree with you. If you put the more demand closer to the generation, one of the ways of helping to decarbonise the energy, and especially give the flexibility with the battery storage as well to try and make best use of energy prices being low and arbitrage. How are you finding the conversation with the data centre operators and dragging them away from their Slough, West London sort of areas in terms of migrating up country?
Yeah, so you've seen a natural kind of move away from the Slough, West London, and what is the flap D markets. All the flap D markets and in the UK, London, is curtailed. And what I mean by curtailed in terms of getting a good, viable, timely grid connection. So there's that kind of push away from that area, but there's also a pull from actually where can we find great brownfield sites, where is the land, where are the renewables, where are the potentially early connections as well. So that there's a pull away to those sites. The other big change is actually, what is the compute load being utilised for? Latency was where the nascent data centre industry started in the UK. Needed to be close to the City of London for low latency requirements. But now when you're looking at AI, large language models, etc., then there is the opportunity to be a little bit more agnostic in terms of location. So it then comes a cost of power, time to power, resiliency of power question.
Interesting. We're coming towards, I think, the end of our time sort of slot for the podcast. Philip might have a question that he wants to ask. I don't know. He's always got a few questions to ask.
Right, so here comes the killer question.
But so while Philip's thinking about that, where do you think you would like the industry to be within sort of 6 months from now?
I think the easiest thing would be to get absolute clarity on the Electricity Act and what is transmission assets, because giving that level of clarity unlocks a number of the other models, and I think it's pretty simplistic. And I say simplistic, not being a lawyer and Casey and everything else. But I think that is a shortcut. You don't need to look at any sort of primary legislation changes, introducing new demand licenses, etc. So I think that's probably the quickest way that we can look. If you didn't do that, then it's transmission license exemption. There's various other tools, but they all feel they're probably harder to get to. So I think that's probably the quickest, easiest one, which gives you the biggest bang for your buck, just given that clarity.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Any final thoughts, questions, Philip?
A quick one for me in terms of, obviously we're looking at transmission connections. I would argue probably because you believe there's too many barriers to entry in terms of the transmission assets being owned by the TO and you being a distribution or an embedded customer of that TO. And obviously one of the ways around it is to allow large demand customers to become transmission owners, operators, and effectively be transmission customers. Is there also not an argument to how do we fix the big problem, which actually means then that those transmission assets could be owned by the TOs and then potentially an extension of the existing assets? And is the answer to facilitate large demand customers to own those transmission assets, or to try and fix the problems, which then means that these assets can then be weaved into the wider network?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, you did have a doozy there, you really did. So I think fundamentally, whoever is the ultimate owner of these assets, the grid is interconnected. As we know, it's a network. Everything has to be delivered to a certain standard. It needs to be reliable, resilient, etc. So you're going to have to underpin all this with the right set of rules, irrespective of who owns it. Talking about the different ownership models, though, it all comes down to pace. Whatever way creates more competition and effectively capacity into the network supply chain can only be a good thing, because that is going to mean there are physically more bodies building infrastructure that's required. The ownership piece, it'll all be owned by different parties in the end anyway, but they'll still need to adhere to the same set of rules. So whatever brings more capacity in to the system as a whole, I'm a real big advocate of. Don't know if that answers your question, but that might be the leading thought.
Yeah. I think so. David, it's been absolutely brilliant to have you with us. Thank you so much for coming in. Thank you, Philip, as well. Thank you, everyone, as well, for listening. There'll be no doubt more to say on the subject of demand connections over the next 6 to 12 months. But for now, thank you for listening and goodbye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining the Connectologist in this exploration. This knowledge sharing is made possible by the support of our clients. We thank them and hope it will help the whole of industry to connect society's critical infrastructure faster. If you found this useful, you're welcome to explore more free insights at roadnighttaylor.co.uk/Connectology, or click on the Insights tab at